There we go. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this Landor Links, the Green Transport Recovery webinar series. This morning, we are going to be discussing the future is smart, the transition from free floating to smart parking on e-scooters. So we'll have a focus on e-scooter parking, but we are also going to touch on some of the wider issues about e-scooters in the public realm as well. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. I think we've got a really exciting, really diverse group of panelists who are going to be able to give us lots of different perspectives on e-scooters, parking and other issues that we might have with them. And we'd like to say a big thank you to Dott for making this webinar possible. If you do have any questions, then please pop them in the questions panel. The format for this morning is that we'll hear from each of our 4 speakers and then we'll have an open Q&A at the end. But if you have questions as we're going through, do pop them in that question box and I can note them down for the end. So this morning we are incredibly lucky to be joined by Ruth Cadbury, who is the MP for Brentford and Isleworth and co-chair of the all-party Parliamentary Group for Cycling and Walking, and was also involved in the Transport Select Committee inquiry on e-scooters. We've got Duncan Robertson, who is the UK General Manager for Dott, one of the e-scooter companies. We've got Rachel Lee, who is a Policy and Research Manager at Living Streets. And then we've got Giacomo Vecia, who is a Strategic Transport Officer for the City of London Corporation. Next slide, please. So I've been asked just to give a little introduction to e-scooters in the UK. I always worry because you have to send your slides in advance, and with e-scooters being such a fast-moving area, I can only ever say approximately how many trials there are in the UK. So at the moment, we've got about 29 trial areas in the UK where it is legal to hire a e-scooter and use it on the roads. Obviously, privately owned e-scooters remain illegal on public roads at the UK at the moment. Most of those trials are single operator short-term rentals, so just one company providing scooters in an area. Although we do have a couple of trials where there's more than one operator, and we do have at least one trial that's looking at a longer term rental model, so leasing scooters for a month rather than minute by minute. Some of the trials have already paused, potentially permanently, due to issues that have arisen. That is one of the great things about experimenting and doing trials. We get to find out what happens as we go along. And for those people who've been watching e-scooter news, then one of the big things that happened recently is that Transport for London have announced a tender that will see e-scooters arriving on the streets of some London boroughs in spring 2021. Now, for commercial reasons, we're not able to explicitly discuss that tender today. So if you do have questions specifically about the tender, I'm afraid we can't talk about them, although we will be able to talk in general about issues that we might expect to encounter when we have e-scooters on London streets. Next slide, please. So one of the things I thought it might be useful to have just before we start today is some shared language. So I've put together a little glossary of e-scooter parking terms, and we have a mix of all 3 of these systems in the UK trials at the moment. So e-scooter parking could be free floating, which means you can park anywhere within the geofence, so anywhere within the operational areas that scooters are working at that time. An operator might have responsible parking rules that say where you can or can't park that scooter, so don't park it in front of a drop curb, try and park it alongside street furniture. And those rules might be enforced perhaps by having a requirement to take a photo when you end your ride. If anyone within London tried the Human Forest dockless bike trial, you had to take a photo of your bike when you finish your ride. Or, and this is more common in the States than elsewhere, you might have what's called a lock to requirement that says you can leave your scooter anywhere in the geofence, but you must lock it to a piece of street furniture or existing bike parking. The benefit of that is it means that your scooter is automatically near an obstacle that already exists. The downside of that is that it uses up a lot of existing bike parking spaces. So that's a little bit controversial. Then you've got the hybrid parking model, and that's where you might have an element of free floating, but also an element of docks or corrals or hubs. So an element of areas where e-scooter companies would like to incentivize you to park your scooters in those locations. And that might be an incentive. So for example, we've got app here saying that if you park in a particular zone, then you might get 5 minutes free ride credit. Or it might be through a stick approach rather than a carrot of saying, well, OK, if you choose to park outside of one of our designated parking zones, then you'll need to pay an additional £5 charge or something like that. So that's the hybrid model. And then we've got the docked model, and that's where you can park only within designated areas. So it might be that the app will not allow you to stop your ride if you park elsewhere, or it might be there's a more significant fine for parking outside of a docked area. And in general, although we'll see a little bit more about the infrastructure on the next slide, the way that these parking in specific areas is enforced is through geofencing, so it's through GPS positioning of the scooters. Next slide, please.
Oh.
Fantastic, thank you. So then if you're looking at e-scooter docks, there's a bit more terminology. I know everybody loves learning all their e-scooter words of the day. So on the left-hand side here, we've got what I would call corrals, because in the States they're often called corrals, but we're seeing more in Europe than perhaps being referred to as hubs. I know it's hubs that Dott will be talking about today. So they are specific areas for scooter and sometimes dockless bike parking, but they're not a physical structure. So they might be, for example, a painted area on the street, it might be a sticker on the street, or it might be that you have some light segregation like that top photo where you might have some bollards or some plastic curbs. So the sort of thing that you might see in a temporary bike lane being used to designate an e-scooter parking area. And those could be on the road, on the carriageway, or they could be on the pavement. And then you have the physical docks, so they are a structure that you would park your scooter at. They might include a charging option. They could be locked to, so you have to physically lock your scooter to the dock, or they can just be leaned to, like that bottom example. And they might include other examples like advertising or vending, or they might be like the park bit that you're seeing at the bottom, which also includes a seating area. I wouldn't expect us to see a lot of permanent docks on UK streets in the short term. Obviously, we've got trials, so operators don't know how long they're able to have permission to run, and investing in this kind of physical infrastructure does add costs. But they are the sort of options that we might see in the future if we do decide to keep e-scooters on UK streets. So that is all that I have for you. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome our first speaker this morning. And our first speaker is Ruth Cadbury, who is, as I said earlier, is the MP for Brentford and Isleworth, co-chair of the all-party Parliamentary Group for Cycling and Walking, and sits on the Transport Select Committee. Ruth, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorna. And I think I'll start with my only slide, please. Right, okay, so my direct experience of e-bikes, of docks and dockless is with the dockless bike schemes that we have had, and I think we're all familiar with pictures, certainly like the one on the left, and the one I, as a politician, I was in local government before 2015, in Hounslow before I was elected to Parliament. So we've all dealt with and are aware of the careless leaving of bikes anywhere, which of course cause a trip hazard, a blockage for crowded footways and so on. And the photo on the right is one I took when I was on a parliamentary visit to Singapore this February, going for a run. And that is what I now, from Lorna, know to call a corral, where if you rent a mobike in Singapore, when you park it, you put it in the corral, and you if you see there's a Q code in the bottom of the picture, you have to scan that and send it at the time you lock and leave your bike. So I think there's other people on the panel today who've spent more time in Singapore than I have, so I'm not quite sure whether you go to prison if you don't do that, because I mean, obviously Singapore has very rigidly enforces public behaviour laws. So, but that's, as I say, that's what I would like to see in terms of the kind of way to prevent the clutter that we've had to experience, that we still see in terms of bikes, high bikes, dockless high bikes that we see, that such as in the left of the photo. I think, you know, obviously, and we're going to hear more about the trials today. I mean, as a member of the Select Committee and as somebody who reckons that e-scooters are going to be with us, they're here to stay. We can't, I don't think the UK can ban e-scooters, but we want the trials to work in order for them to work because of the benefit they provide in their own right, but also as a way to develop appropriate regulations and also appropriate behaviour in terms of e-scooter riding anyway. As people will know, I was on the Select Committee that reported on the government's approach to e-scooters. So we're looking out for the trials. We had real concerns about the conditions for riders, that they have to have a driving license and insurance, and so we have some concerns about those. And as I say, one of the biggest concerns in general about e-scooters is about antisocial behaviour, both in terms of selfish parking, just dumping them in the middle of the footway, and also riding on footways as well. We're told by the companies that the geo-fencing and the geo-positioning will be so good that one can be penalised for straying outside the required areas, so riding on footways or dumping bikes away from parking areas. But I don't know how sensitive the geo-positioning is to be able to do that. But you know, that's why I'm very pleased to be on the panel, because I can listen to what the other speakers who've got more experience of how it's actually rolling out, both here and in other countries, can say. So you know, if we want e-scooters as an active travel, or as a travel method to be legal, and I would like to see that, because I think they have a lot of advantages over some alternatives such as motor scooters and so on, and they do ensure that people have a choice if they don't want to be on public transport post-COVID. But you know, it'll only be successful as a mode of transport, an acceptable mode of transport, if the behaviour issues are sorted in these trials. There's also an issue I have, which isn't so much for this session today, but from our experience in Hounslow and Ealing with mobikes, where we set up a memorandum of understanding with mobikes, where we had mobikes available across the two boroughs, and gradually, as the market conditions developed, they're only now available in two very small areas of Hounslow and Ealing, where it's commercially viable for them. So I am concerned about ensuring there is accessibility to this useful form of transport in areas which may not be so commercially lucrative for the companies. So that's my other wider concern about e-scooters. So that's all from me. Thank you, Lorna.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Ruth. Really interesting, and I learned something today, because I'd not seen the Singapore example of using QR codes to identify which dock you'd parked in, so I will add that to my notes. So our next speaker is going to be Duncan Robertson, who is the UK General Manager for Dott. Dott have just produced, together with 6T, who are a transport consultancy in Paris, and Momentum, who are a London transport consultancy, a really interesting report about the evolution of e-scooter and micromobility parking in Paris, and what's changed over time there, and then how that might look applying some of those lessons learned in a London context. So I'm really excited to hear what Duncan's got to say. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. As Lorna says, I'm Duncan Robertson. I am the UK General Manager for Dott. We are an electric bike and scooter operator. We operate bikes and scooters across most of Europe, in Italy, Belgium, Poland, Germany and France. In France, we recently won a couple of major tenders to operate at very large scale in Paris and Lyon. We are strong proponents of smart parking and what that means, and I'll go into it in a little bit, but it's definitely towards the docked end of Lorna's spectrum of parking options. As a real alternative to free floating, and I'll talk you through some of those things as we go through the presentation now. So if we can go to the next slide, thank you. Yes, as it says, parking is absolutely mission critical for us to be able to realise some of those benefits that that Ruth mentioned around e-scooters, but also e-bikes. We need good parking to be able to succeed. As has been mentioned on a couple of occasions and will come up a lot, is the experiences to date, particularly the UK, have been largely bad. They've been pretty problematic. And as an industry, I don't think we've really been able to realise these benefits because of the issues that we've seen, as you can see in that image of London. I particularly like that it's under a sign that says "Think Bike." So yeah, we've not really been able to strike that right balance between kind of allowing for riders to have a good rider experience, which is one of the real benefits of having a completely free floating system, and allowing for non-riders to have a positive experience and not have to, step over bikes or scooters, as you see in those images, and really be able to limit the amount of street clutter that is caused. So in order to deliver and eliminate, in order to eliminate free floating, we need to have some kind of alternative, and that's where parking comes into this. So why is it so important? Parking space benefits everyone, and now this is really important. And I think that having been in this industry for quite some time, there was definitely the early days of free floating, particularly in bikes, was the desires of the operator versus the desires of the local authority, and the non-rider element were not quite meshing, but now they very much do with the technology that's available. So having parking provision really benefits the riders, it benefits non-riders, it benefits local authorities, and it benefits the operators as well. So from a non-rider perspective, back up. From a non-rider perspective, we keep the streets orderly and tidy and free from the clutter that we've seen already in the images shown so far. From a local authority perspective, it makes incorporating parking into the urban realm much easier, because it's lines on the street or stickers or whatever it may be, signposts. It's all within the gambit of what local authorities are able to deliver, and it also reduces complaints. From an operator's perspective, it makes the operations much more efficient. Instead of having to traipse around trying to find individual vehicles that are kind of scattered all over the place, they're all grouped, and it's much easier to kind of go and do battery swaps, or go and do cleaning, or go and do maintenance. So it makes the operations that much better as well. From a rider perspective, it will work if you can provide a decent network, because people can know where to pick up and where to deploy their vehicles. But riders are definitely the most impacted if we go for a fully kind of docked or hub-based system, because undeniably free floating is the most convenient, and that's what this is all about, is convenience. So we need to kind of counteract that. But firstly, and I'll address that later, but before I do, I want to talk a little bit about can this smart parking thing actually work? So now if we go to the next slide. And hopefully you can see from these two maps that yes, it absolutely can work. You can see here, and this is from Paris. This is the Champs-Élysées before smart parking was implemented, and after it was implemented, and after bays were put in place. We're now able to see about 97% parking compliance. And I think, yeah, the images really kind of speak for themselves, to be honest. So what have we learned? That good dockless parking is absolutely possible. It's not a pipe dream. It's certainly not cultural. That's one of the things that a lot of people suggest, that oh, you know, people in Europe are, you know, going to treat these things differently, and they're going to, you know, park nicer because they're, you know, it's not Britain. I get that one a lot, but it really isn't the case, because particularly for our solution, the way that we do this is that we don't do incentives. We don't incentivize people to park correctly, because good parking, as I've said in the slide, is not optional. There's no fines for parking outside, because you cannot end your journey if you are not in a bay. So that's really, really critical, and that's what, particularly for large cities, dense cities, inner cities, that's the kind of level of compliance that we need to be seeing, and leading in, allowing these little edge cases for, you know, incentivizing, which people don't really go for, or fining, which is convenient but still leads to some street clutter. I think we want to be kind of stamping that out completely. But as I mentioned before, this does come at a cost, and the cost is generally to the rider. Therefore, if the rider can't find a vehicle when they need one, then we're going to impact the effectiveness of these trials and these schemes more generally, and the benefits will potentially not be realised. So that is why a good network, or great network, is so essential. Now we go to the next slide. So as Lorna mentioned, 6T and Momentum did a really great study on learning from Paris. It's a long document. It's up on our website, and it may even be in the link in this as well. It's well worth a read. It's really quite fascinating. I've not been able to distill all of it. I've taken 3 images out of a 50-page document, but you know, such is the time that we have. But I think these 3 really kind of highlight some of the key benefits and things that we can learn from Paris. So first of all, user experience. I've alluded to this already. Walking distance is absolutely key. We know that micromobility is about convenience. It's a kind of discretionary mode. If it's not, if vehicles aren't available, then and visible, and where people need them, they're just not going to use them. And you can see from that top left, those 2 pie charts, that most people, once you start getting to a 5-minute walk to a vehicle, you start losing people at a very, very rapid rate. 2 minutes is great. Almost everyone is comfortable with that. The second key point is in the map below, which you can see in Paris, is the density of parking bays or hubs, or whatever we want to call them. Paris at the moment has 2,500, and that's a density of about 32 per square kilometre. Which in Paris is less than a minute's walk from each one, which is really, really superb. And this is definitely the kind of gold standard level of where we want to be, and it can get better. The third point, if we move over to the right hand side with this map of Outer London, is that locating the stations is absolutely critical. For example, in Outer London, we can really start to see areas open up. The map that you see there is 10-minute trips, up to 10-minute trips to local town centres. So this is not about commuting into central London. This is about opening up areas that are often, as Ruth alluded to, forgotten when it comes to these things. And you know, if we start looking at these and providing a decent network of stations around local town centres, then we can start to bring people to those areas and kind of improve economies and so on. The stats that 6T have pulled out on this is that 65% of outer London is accessible within 10 minutes on a scooter or bike. So that's a significant amount. And in order to get to a rail hub, that number rises to 75%. Inner London, it's almost 100% coverage to get within 10 minutes of on a scooter or a bike to a rail hub. So yeah, this is the kind of realization of what a good parking network can deliver, particularly in areas, as I say, like outer London. So if we head to the next slide, and this is my final slide. I just want to leave you with kind of what I see as my my parking vision, and it is quite simply that we need to have a dense network of customer-centric parking with mandatory parking as a requirement. So I'll leave you there and hand over back to Lorna, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Duncan. Thank you very much. That is an excellent job of summarising that report, because I think that took me about 2 hours to go through it, carefully making notes as I went through. So to summarise it in 3 slides is really impressive. We've got over 100 attendees with us, and people have been putting really interesting questions into that question box. So if you do have any questions for us, do keep putting them in throughout so that we're ready to go with that Q&A after we've heard from our speakers. But next up will be our 3rd speaker, who will be Rachel Lee, who is the Policy and Research Manager for Living Streets. So over to you, Rachel.
Hiya. I've only got the 1 slide like Ruth. May I have that slide, please? Lovely picture of some scooters on the pavement. So I'm going to just provide a bit of an overview of where Living Streets comes into this. We're the national charity for walking, and obviously our concern is scooters on the pavement, but I'm just going to probably cover some of the issues that have been discussed already. So e-scooters, as we've heard, are illegal. Privately owned ones are illegal to use on public highways, but their use on our towns, on our roads in our towns and cities, is becoming more and more visible. And sales increased 50% in 2019. In May this year, we had the short 2-week consultation on legalising the rental e-scooter trials. And proposals were brought forward a year and expanded from an initial 4 sites to an open invitation, really, for LA's local authorities to send in expressions of interest. And we now have well over 20 trials, some over multiple locations in England, and we're obviously going to be discussing London and the proposed trials here in London too. So why the rush? Well, we've obviously had a drop in public transport use because of the pandemic, and it's been suggested that e-scooters can solve that last mile of the journey. And pre-COVID evidence from across Europe seems to back this up, in that e-scooter use is part of multimodal journeys, but it also tends to replace walking journeys and trips by public transport. And I just want to mention this because clearly what we know in terms of journey types, if a journey is under a mile, then currently 80% of those trips would be walked. And we should be perhaps encouraging those journeys to be walked. And so this is more about transport priorities in general, particularly in terms of obesity crisis, now the pandemic as a public health crisis, but also climate change, thinking about the most efficient and energy sort of efficient and environmentally efficient way of getting around, which is walking. So I mention this just to make sure that we give walking its due priority. But let's face it, scooters are here to stay. So what are we going to do with them? How are we going to deal with them? When I first spoke to the Transport Select Committee this summer, I raised a number of issues that Living Streets are concerned with. These centre around the speed and power of e-scooters, their improper use and parking, but also their safety. Now, mobility scooters, in contrast, which are allowed on the pavement, travel at 4 miles per hour. Heck, I've just jumped through my notes. Excuse me, I've just jumped a bit. So the speed issue was to do with the maximum speed of e-scooters. Obviously, they've come in at 15.5 miles an hour. In contrast, mobility scooters, which are allowed on the pavement, have a 4 mile an hour limit. So it's this speed differential which creates the danger really for pedestrians, and why we're absolutely adamant that pedestrians and e-scooters must be kept separate. So I don't think there's any argument about e-scooters being allowed on the pavement, but they shouldn't be parked there either. And there's 2 reasons for this. So the first is, if you are inviting people to park on the pavement, you're essentially inviting them to ride up on the pavement too. But also, you know, we don't want space taken away from walking. So the parking space should definitely be in the carriageway, you know, take car parking space away. We've also objected to dockless rental schemes because experience elsewhere shows that will will dump scooters where they fancy, as we've seen in Ruth's photos and elsewhere in the other presentations. So This obviously creates an obstruction for pedestrians, especially for people with mobility and visual impairments. And vandalism can be a problem too. So I'm going to look at the experience in Paris too. And what we've seen there is that both in Paris and other French cities, dockless schemes have essentially become docked in terms of the provision of the designated on-road spaces. In Paris, operators are charged €35 per scooter for scooters parked on the pavement. Now, that makes them responsible for end-user behaviour, and they, as a result, employ teams of people to round up abandoned scooters and ensure that others are parked more neatly. And I guess this is where the incentivising of good parking for customers comes in. Operators also pay an annual licence fee of €55 to €65 per scooter, depending on their fleet size, which could help pay for the provision of on-street parking. And if we return to the issue that's of most concern to pedestrians in terms of scooting on the pavement, we see that riders there are fined €135 for riding on the pavement. Now, riding privately owned scooters is not such an issue outside of the UK, but what we would want to see is that fines for improper use, for scooting on the pavement is applied equally to people using rental scooters and privately owned scooters. We also still have concerns around the safety of e-scooters. And let's face it, they're not really that well designed to deal with potholes. And I'm going to quote my favourite survey, the Alarm Survey UK, which tells us that there's about an 8-year backlog to clear carriageway maintenance repairs in London. And last year, councils filled more than 85,500 potholes, costing £4.8 million, and paid out £1.2 million in compensation claims. And reiterating evidence that I gave to the committee, Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents has suggested that e-scooters could basically represent a significant public health problem. ROSPA has estimated that about 1,500 people have sustained e-scooter injuries in the US since 2017, and we've obviously had a couple of deaths in London. Now, you might ask, why am I making that point? Well, the point is that when people are worried about the state of the carriageway that they're scooting on, or they don't like the traffic, they move on to the pavement. And it's how do you prevent that sort of behaviour? So in summary, it remains, I think, for us to see how e-scooters fit into the overall transport equation. But from our perspective at Living Streets, we believe that making space for moving and or stationary scooters must not be at pedestrians' expense, so they belong on the road. Active travel, walking and cycling, should remain the transport priority for shorter journeys. But of course, improvements in cycling infrastructure will benefit scooting too. But making operators responsible for end user behaviour incentivises better parking. So we'd like to see that. And civil enforcement, both against private and rental scooter use, is going to be essential to prevent riding on the pavement. Thank you. I finished.
Yeah, sorry, I was just slightly late. I activated myself again. Thank you very much, Rachel. That was incredibly interesting to hear from your experience from elsewhere as well. We are running perfectly to time at the moment, so thank you very much to all of our speakers. So I will now invite our last speaker. This is Giacomo Vecia. He is a Strategic Transport Officer at the City of London Corporation. So Giacomo, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Lorna. Can everyone hear me okay? Hi, as Lorna was saying, I'm Giacomo Vecia. I'm a Strategic Transportation Officer with the City of London Corporation. I'm also a dockless vehicle policy portfolio manager, and some of my responsibilities have included running our dockless bike trial recently and co-drafting some of the bylaw and e-scooter text that's being used in London to this day. I've been invited to speak to you a little bit about some of the experiences and journey that we've had with dockless in the city, to highlight some of the technical policy and legislative context that exists here in London around dockless vehicles, and to just explore some of the challenges and opportunities that lie in improving dockless operations and specifically parking within the capital. Next slide, please. So I thought I would just start off with a very brief history of dockless vehicles in London. A couple years ago, people might remember that there was a number of operators that launched in the capital. There was two significantly large operators, international in nature, that launched Mobike and Ofo. and they deployed what we call kind of the terrible twos within the industry informally. It was a really challenging time for both operators and for local authorities, as they oftentimes weren't operating in collaboration with local authorities to try and ensure that their operations were managed in an appropriate way. And a lot of the issues that have come up from that were highlighted in the previous talks, so I won't labor over it. But interestingly, the entire experience highlighted that there's a significant policy and legislative vacuum that exists in London in trying to manage vehicles like this. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into that in the next couple slides. So next slide, please. I use this slide to illustrate that trying to figure out a solution for any transport-related issue in London is a bit of a challenge. There's 34 highway authorities, as some of you might be aware, within the capital, the 32 boroughs, the City of London, and Transport for London. And we've all got our own different policy contexts and urban infrastructure and transport networks. And it's pretty much like trying to find some similar musical tastes in a map like this. But ultimately, we were all using the same playbook. There were 3 pieces of really relevant legislation that emerged from some of the digging that we did on trying to understand the tools that we had to work with when we first encountered dockless vehicle use. The bottom 2, the Highways Act of 1980 and the Road Traffic Regulation Act of 1984, ended up becoming some of our main tools in trying to combat inappropriate parking and the negative externalities of dockless vehicle use. And the top left one, the Local Government Act of 1972, is a really interesting piece of legislation that speaks to and informed the development of the Panlinen bylaw, which I'm going to try and speak a little bit about later. Let's go to the next slide. So those couple of tools that I just mentioned, the 2 bottom left acts, helped us in dealing with some of the parking issues that emerged when dockless providers first emerged on our streets. They gave us 3 distinct kind of powers over certain types of parking. And it was quite challenging nonetheless as we worked to interpret some of those. But the 3 main things that we could do in the face of inappropriately parked and mismanaged dockless bikes at the time were designate them a nuisance. On the far left, you can kind of see any bike that maybe was abandoned or could act as an eyesore. We could post on those bikes with a notice period, go through a relatively complicated magistrate process, and then eventually work to remove that bike. A number of people, and particularly elected officials, unfortunately thought that it was relatively simple to remove bikes and debris from our streets. But there was a lot of challenges in that time to try and actually proceed with that process. And it incurred significant costs, both monetary and resource-wise, to local authorities. If bikes were posing an obstruction like they might in the middle picture, we oftentimes could still notify. In the city, we decided to take a slightly more aggressive approach, perhaps, and seek to move those bikes out of the way. We weren't allowed to remove them at first, but we could also post notice on them that they were posing as an obstruction and go through a similar magistrate process to try and move them. And on the far right, you can see there's a couple mobikes that have fallen into a street, and anytime that those bikes really pose a significant danger to other road users, which is a relatively narrow definition within the law and statute, we were able to act a little bit more quickly and immediately remove and review the location of those parked bikes. Ultimately, those were the main tools that local authorities had in London to deal with the first swing of dockless bike operations. And it was a really challenging time to try and figure out ways to improve and manage operations. We ultimately started to work more closely with dockless bike operators, as Duncan highlighted in some of his discussion, and it led to an interesting challenge that emerged when we started to sign some MOUs across the capital. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a map of a dockless bike operator that made it into London. And it's following the conclusion of a number of discussions with a number of different boroughs in the City of London and trying to figure out how to manage parking within the context of London without some of these proper legislative tools that other international cities might have had to fine inappropriately parked bikes or to properly locate and legislate or license operations. So in here, you can see there's at least 6 different types of parking area on this particular map that were implemented both by the operator and by the local authorities in conjunction with them. And ultimately, it led to a difficult time for users trying to navigate the system. And it also made it difficult for operators to maintain serviceable and profitable areas within the capital. It was really difficult to try and find the right balance to strike. And even with trials that were implemented across London, it still became relatively apparent that we needed additional tools to try and manage parking and identify parking bays that we could properly hold operators to account and to use. Next slide, please. And these are just a couple more maps. I like to call the bottom left one, I think it's a historical map of some of Lime's operation areas. It reminds me of a Picasso. It really just highlights how difficult it was to try and navigate identifying appropriate parking areas and behaviors within the context that we had in the legislative tools. The top right one was a first pass within the city and some of our adjacent areas to identify bays, but even then that still produced relatively complex areas that made it challenging for users to identify appropriate parking locations. And ultimately, it called for a different course of action. Next slide, please. Despite all of this work with new operators and trying to find ways to improve parking compliance, the number of complaints and inappropriately parked bikes continued to increase over the last 2 or 3 years. This is an example of a photo that was taken, and I find it quite creative the way that the bikes were inappropriately parked. But it really highlights that even with the entrant of new, slightly more responsible bike operators, it still was a significant challenge to try and find ways to entice, to provide those carrots and sticks that were mentioned previously to ensure that bike operations were done in an appropriately managed way. Next slide, please. So this generated a lot of attention, as many of you are aware, and a number of local authorities within London decided to undertake trials. The City of London Corporation decided to do so as well. We started working on our trial back in 2018, and that was something that we worked on alongside the development of a pan-London bylaw, which many of you might be aware of. It was a piece of legislation that was being drafted by the 32 boroughs, the City of London Corporation, London Councils, and Transport for London, using that 1972 Local Government Act and a very interesting clause within it to try and develop some powers to identify and hold to account those dockless operators that might not be behaving in appropriate ways and allowing bikes to be parked inappropriately. Core to the bylaw was identifying approved parking areas, being able to identify no-go zones, go-slow zones, and figuring out a relative framework to provide operators a level playing field that also gave local authorities the tools to properly manage the parking locations of those bikes. Next slide, please. In the city, we decided to go with a bay-to-bay model. We identified about 60 bays across the city, demarcated them. There was space for roughly 300 dockless bikes at the time, and we allowed 2 operators, the no longer active Free Bike and Barrel, to operate exclusively within those bays. The bays we tried to locate the bays approximately 2 to 5 minutes from one another and ensure that most of the city, about 95% of it, was within 5 minutes of a dockless bay or corral, as we were calling them previously. And the trial itself was relatively complex, but we used the framework that was developed through the Pan-London bylaw to try and identify an appropriate set of terms and criteria to hold operators to better operational practices and ensure that dockless operations in the city were slightly more organized. Next slide, please. And concluding the trial after about a year, we did find that we had relative success. It was a challenge in the early stages, but we were able to achieve within the 2 operators that were permitted to park in the city parking compliance of over 90%, over 20,000 plus trips. And the number of public complaints that we received regarding dockless operations and inappropriately parked bikes in the city for those operators decreased significantly. So it was clear that by implementing a bay-to-bay model, we were able to improve operations within the city. I'm sure that's not very much of a surprise to many people, but within London and within the unique policy context, it was quite a success for us to be able to work with operators without the necessary legislative tools to try and find an amenable approach. Next slide, please. So it didn't come without its challenges, the trial. I just highlighted a few of the challenges here, for perhaps as talking points for later as well. And these are relatively basic challenges. There was a lot of really interesting discussion previously about the level of tech that has been developed in dockless operations and using that tech to improve operations of trials. But ultimately, within London, there's still a number of relatively basic constraints that make it difficult for operations to be successful. On the operator side, it's working out those sticks and carrots and tuning them to ensure that bay-to-bay operation can work, and we've heard a little bit about that. One of the significant challenges for the city and for a few other areas within London is trying to manage GPS accuracy in tall building clusters. We found that it can be quite difficult to maintain the accuracy necessary and to employ a bay-to-bay model when you're working in areas with a number of tall buildings. And at the time, the technology was not necessarily there to prevent bikes from parking outside of those bays. So it did require some retrofitting or some new tech solutions to try and ensure that bike operators were able to manage their operations appropriately. On the highway authority side of things, we found that there were significant challenges just in resourcing the identification of those bays and finding some of that initial capital investment to deploy the trial. It's a challenging time for local authorities across the UK, and COVID has highlighted the financial constraints that we have. So it's been particularly difficult to try and move forward on developing the locations for those bays, which, as we've heard, is essential to a successful trial and to maintaining quality of service that users will want to actually use. Next slide, please. And I haven't even gone into mentioning e-scooters, but a number of people in this webinar have. It's something that is on our radar as well. Well, the case for e-scooters is going to be slightly different, as the DFT has labeled them as vehicles, and they are required to follow certain legislative guidelines. So they aren't going to be just able to park wherever they want, as long as the local authority decides to follow that particular approach. But there's still a number of questions left unanswered about how we're going to manage the intermingling of these two modes within operations, especially when dockless scooters and dockless bikes are required to park in similar bays, whether there's going to be multiple types of operators operating at the same time across the capital, some participating in a highly regulated e-scooter trial, and others participating with MOUs or just operating freely within the capital under the dockless bike operation guidance that they've received so far. And there's a number of constraints around COVID as well that we need to keep in mind around sanitation and security of these vehicles, particularly while there's not a lot of eyes on the street and while we're working to understand what a recovery looks like to people getting back into workplaces. Next slide, please. And so with that, I think I've just about run over my time, but I hope that's provided a bit of an interesting background to some of the policy and legislative constraints that we faced across the capital and in the city while we're trying to manage the operation of dockless bikes. It's been really interesting to hear what the other speakers have discussed, and we're hoping to continue to progress towards a model like Paris has, where we're able to properly manage bay-to-bay operations of bikes and e-scooters in order to maintain and maximize the benefits that we get from those particular modes. The City of London transport strategy, as well as the Mayor's transport strategy, highlights the importance of walking and cycling, and we believe that scooting can form a part of that, but we are mindful of the challenges that those modes, and particularly e-scooters, will face to city streets in the future. And with that, thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I mean, for me, this morning has been really fascinating in terms of seeing what we can learn from the history of dockless vehicles in the UK, and then also the current reality of e-scooters elsewhere around the world, and then how we can apply that learning to e-scooters in the UK. But I will accept that might just be my own personal nerdiness. We are now entering the Q&A section, so if I can have all of the speakers back with their cameras on, probably stay muted unless you're directly answering a question for now. We've had a really great range of questions coming in. Do keep putting the questions into the question box. I'm going to start with some relatively techish questions about parking before we open into a more broader discussion. So we've had a little cluster of questions about enforcement. So the first one was something that Giacomo touched on, and so maybe Giacomo and Duncan, you might talk about how you are able to enforce parking in bays, docks, corrals, hubs, whatever you want to call them, given the limits of the geofencing technology.
So I'll take this one first, if that's okay, Giacomo. The key thing here is, as I mentioned, in our system, we don't allow people to park unless they're in this space. So there's no kind of grey area there. In terms of the technology, I totally accept that sometimes there can be some inaccuracies. And this is where really working together with the local authority to make sure that bays, in whatever guise they form, from a just painting on the ground, a signpost, to a full benched area that we've seen. So there's a real range, but what we need to include is this visual cue on the street, so that people know exactly where to put them, and the City of London have done an excellent job of doing that. So what that means is there are some edge cases where you get to one, you're in it, but the GPS hasn't quite pinpointed you, and then you can take a photo and that gets checked, and then we send people around if there's problems. So we're able to deal with those edge cases if necessary, but we don't see it as a major barrier, and for the most part it works very well. Second to that is that the technology continues to advance. So we are not all entirely reliant on the GPS system, which has its weaknesses. So, for example, in bikes and scooters, we have a number of additional technologies that improve our accuracy down even further. So, for our Dott bike, it comes in under a meter with the other options that we have on top of the GPS. So. The third element that I would add on top of that is that because certainly from our perspective, we're using electric vehicles, we have a large number of people looking around and going out and changing batteries and doing cleaning and all of that, doing maintenance, all these kind of things that we need to do on our fleet. So compared to the original round of dockless bikes that we've seen in the UK, where the operations team is actually very, very small because you don't need to really intervene on a bike very often, that is completely flipped on its head. So apart from anything else, we're able to see the city and be in the city with eyes on the street. So those are kind of the three kind of main things that differentiate from before and allow us to kind of deliver what we say we can. Giacomo, it would be interesting to hear your experiences with the companies that you worked with before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Duncan, you did a really good job of highlighting the kind of emerging tech that's coming to enable operators to improve their parking compliance rates. In our experiences with operators, we found that as we develop more and more tech, they do help to improve parking compliance rates further and further. And on the local authority side, we are starting to also identify kind of more novel ways to manage enforcement. It's difficult at the time. Traditionally, we use on-street presence, so street environment officers or police officers that are walking around that can then report inappropriately parked bikes. But we've been recently looking at the potential for using CCTV camera networks that are regularly used to monitor traffic, to identify whether there might be inappropriately parked vehicles in particularly high traffic location and manage the congestion or obstruction that those might cause. We're also looking into machine learning and visual analytics on some of our fleet vehicles. So as they're able to drive around parts of the city, either to collect trash or to maintain parts of the highway, they might be able to project feed of particularly high trafficked parking locations or areas where we know parking compliance isn't particularly high, and feed that back into a central base where we can then review that footage and try and take action if necessary, either on operators or on users. And I think ultimately enforcement it needs some teeth as well. And I think the parking model in Paris, where they definitely back up their scheme with some fines. Unfortunately, it's difficult for operators to work with those fines sometimes, but I think they are ultimately kind of the line of last defense to ensure that people do behave responsibly and do maintain appropriate parking behaviors. And then obviously there's things like vandalism and misdemeaning and whatnot, where people are going to move things out of bays irrationally. But ultimately, I think a combination of technology, of trying to step up our enforcement and ability to supervise operations, as well as legislative tools and fines, is probably the best way forward.
Does anybody else have anything else they'd like to add on that question? No, super. Then I will move on to a second strand about enforcement. We've had 2 questions from Tom at LCC, although he might be here in his personal capacity. So one, obviously, Duncan, with Dott, you've gone to the model of forced hub-based parking. So much like a Santander cycle, if it's not in a parking area, the ride can't be stopped and you'll continue to be charged. Did you try any other models like that, offering free ride minutes for good parking, or having small fines for poor parking beforehand to get to that stage? And then a second question along that theme about fines and charges for poor parking, about what effect they have on that sort of nub of users who show persistently bad behaviour. And perhaps Giacomo, you might be able to talk about how, if the fines are going on to the operators, do we see examples of them passing them on to users, blocking users, those kind of things? So again, 2 questions about enforcement in terms of pretty much the best carrots and sticks for enforcing good parking.
So we've definitely used fining in the past in some of our operations, where if you don't park in the appropriate location, you get a fine. This can work. It allows, depending on what the city makeup is, what the kind of people view, how people view this, and what the urban realm looks like. It can be quite useful to allow that system to be in place, where someone can park outside for convenience, but they do have to pay some kind of surcharge. However, for cities like London, and as I said before, very, very kind of dense areas, with ancient streets and that are very narrow, we prefer to not do that. We haven't deployed a huge amount of incentives, mainly because the team have got an awful lot of experience in this industry, and we've just never seen it really work to the level that it needs to work at. People, it's about convenience, and the minor incentives that you can offer don't really drive the levels of behaviour that we need to see, particularly in the very dense city makeup that we're talking about. So that's why we've kind of steered away from those solutions and gone for a slightly more, harder line. But as I say, if we can incorporate that with a decent network of parking, then it actually doesn't become a problem. And people, you'll see in the 6T report as well, people start to actually appreciate it, and they just get to understand it, and that's fine. In many ways, it's better to start at that end and then loosen, as opposed to the other way around, which we've kind of already seen with dockless, was very, very laissez-faire, and we're now trying to tighten it up, and that's a bit of a challenge for users. I think that certainly if we're in trial periods, as we are with these things, we should start from the other end and then loosen if appropriate. I'll let Giacomo take the questions around the kind of regulatory enforcement, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think just to follow up on your comments as well, we found in the past that when we've tried to encourage fines, and I think it's important to note that in London we can't mandate any fines, so it's basically at the goodwill of any operator operating a dockless bike scheme in London to implement fines. But when we have implemented those fines through an operator, they tend to pass them on to the users and then eventually block out the users. And I think ultimately, as a policy officer, I try to echo Rachel and Ruth's thinking in that the priority for us is kind of people walking on streets, people feeling safe, existing modes. And so, we acknowledge that there's a really tiny proportion of these users of dockless schemes that tend to generate a lot of that really bad behavior, but we'd prefer to have it so that that tiny proportion are really dissuaded, and there's a real significant cost for misbehaving, because ultimately we do think that these kinds of trials and these modes can deliver our policy aims, but without really having those teeth, I think we put ourselves at risk. And to widen this point a little bit further as well, a lot of the feedback that we get around e-scooter and e-bike and dockless bike usage, it kind of contributes to the wider discourse on bike use and active travel within London, as people have sort of recoiled against dockless use. We've found that there's further worsening of sentiments towards people cycling, and there's a further kind of worsening of the feel that people have of walking safely on streets. And again, it's unfortunate because it's a real minority of users that end up behaving poorly. At least that's our experience in the city, where we've had over 20,000 rides during the trial period, and there were very little public complaints around the users of those particular operators. But ultimately, we need to do everything that we can to try and protect people that walk on our streets and make sure that they feel safe and prioritize those modes that are most widely used. In the city, for instance, 90% of people have a walking trip that is either comprised entirely of their journey to work or as walk from the station to their final place of employment. So ultimately, those are the modes that we would prioritize, and we think it's fair then to find the right balance through incorporating appropriate fines and appropriate measures to try and dissuade people. It's difficult. I don't want to necessarily speak to what that's going to look like in London and what that could look like, because the legislative context isn't necessarily there yet. But under the bylaw, there would be the ability for us to seek summary convictions against poorly behaving operators, and whether they pass that on to their users is yet to be seen. But so far, they trend to try and block users entirely if they behave poorly regularly, and I think that's the appropriate approach.
Okay, as ever with this sort of topic, we've got lots of useful information coming in from our audience as well. So again, Tom, I pronounced that wrong. Tom from LCC, who posed some of those questions, said that he has heard that for one dockless bike or maybe scooter firm found that 25% of users who were fined then dropped out of the service. I suppose the question for us would be whether or not that might be a good thing or a bad thing. If they're not a responsible user, do we want them using that service? And then Sebastian, who I believe is one of your colleagues at Dott, Duncan, says that he thinks from the jump bikes in Hackney, where there was a £2 surcharge if you parked outside the bays, the result was that less than 50% of bikes were parking in bays. So some really interesting comments there from our audience. I'm going to ask one more question on enforcement before opening up questions more broadly, because I think we really want to use some of Rachel and Ruth's expertise here as well. So we've got a question from Ian Davey about the enforcement of on-carriageway corrals. So if you have a dockless vehicle parking space which is on the road and perhaps it only has paint delineating it, how do you stop cars using that space? I can give a non-expert lived experience. I live in Hackney. We had a couple of dockless bike operators, and the deal was that they had to have docks. We're in a CPZ, so a controlled parking zone, and the way that our local authority managed it was that they suspended parking in a number of bays. So a sign was put up saying you are no longer allowed to park in this bay. This is no longer a parking bay, it is a dockless vehicle bay. And the enforcement for that is as normal parking enforcement. When our traffic enforcement officers are wandering around the streets, if they see a car parked in a bay that it shouldn't be, then they will ticket it. Anecdotally, I wouldn't say it was hugely successful. Quite often when I was walking to the shops, I would see cars parked in bays that had been suspended. But I also know that before COVID, the kind of longer term plan was that those bays would have some light segregation in. And of course, the longer that a bay is not a car parking bay and is a dockless vehicle bay, and the more often that there are dockless vehicles parked in them, you get some of that behavioural side of things. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on enforcement of on-road or on-carriageway bays.
I would just add that add to your point, Lorna, that making sure that in certain areas a certain level of physical infrastructure will be needed, would be a small flector bollard, certainly a bit of delineation with lining, and what we use in Paris is a small picto of a scooter or a bike, to show that this is something different to what people are used to. But I think the most critical thing, and this is kind of key for the operation, is that there shouldn't be bays that are left completely empty for long periods of time that allow for car drivers to think that they're or deliberately parking them because there's space there. You know, a well-managed network shouldn't actually suffer that, and there should always be vehicles there, kind of making their own delineation, as it were. But as you say, over time, people become very, very aware of what's going on. But key to that is a little bit of infrastructure and some careful signing.
Ruth, I know you wanted to chip in there.
Well, all I would say is if this isn't got right, we've got a real problem for the future of e-scooters and hiring e-scooters in the UK, because, you know, you look at a lot of community social media, you'd think that every single person on a bike always cycles through red lights. And, you know, you can see the delicate balance that's going on in terms of the implementation of safe cycling and walking space. So, you know, I have to say the operators have to get this right. They have to get the carrot and stick processes right with the users, with the membership, people subscribing. You know, you have that opportunity because anybody signing up has you know, that you've got their card details, so you can do carrots and sticks for good behavior. And Lorna said she'd not seen the QR code on the corral that was in my slide from the Mobike scheme in Singapore. That strikes me as quite a good way of ensuring that scooters and bikes are parked safely. So that's all I would say. We've got to get this right, because, you know, there are some cities and countries that have banned e-scooters completely because of problems with the rollout.
And I thought I would just add another layer of complexity, maybe highlight the technical issues around that original question too. I agree with what you're saying, Ruth, and it's a challenge. I know, Duncan, you were mentioning, you know, we need to make sure that the bays are marked and have bollards and stuff, and I would fully agree. Ultimately, right now, there's, as transport planners, we rely on something called the DSRGB, which is basically a big book of regulations that say what we can and can't paint on roads and what's legal and not legal. And given that these are all trials, there's nothing out there that we can really use that says, okay, this is exactly what you're meant to be putting down for a dockless vehicle bay that's mixing bikes and scooters in it. So it becomes a real challenge to try and identify what specifically we put in those bays. Did you want to jump in on that?
Sorry, I thought of a question I do want to ask you, Giacomo, about those 3 strands of enforcement you can use, because as far as I was concerned, and I'm sure Rachel feels the same way, all of those were dangerous, you know. So
yeah, so it's really challenging, and I think just wanting to wrap up the previous question as well with the enforcement of those bays in Hackney. I used to also live in Hackney, and I can speak to your experience, Lorna. And it's going to be challenging to manage on-street bays. A lot of times what we're using now is experimental traffic orders, which is another kind of workaround to try and manage these trials, where we hand over some of these carriageway spaces for these particular uses. But ultimately, users of the streets can kind of play a bit of a I didn't know what was going on card when they accidentally or inappropriately park in bays that remain empty, which can create challenges and problems, because it's difficult to communicate to people all these various changes if you don't have a standard signage that goes onto the ground. Then a person looking at a Hackney bay where there's a post that has a blue sign on it that says dockless parking here, that comes to the city, and suddenly they see a large P on the ground with a bike inside of it, and it really makes it difficult for users to understand what it is exactly that they're looking out for when they're trying to find dockless parking bays. So there's an argument here that part of the solution to enforcement issues of carriageway bays is actually to develop standards for what a bay looks and feels like, and what it exhibits in certain environments. And on streets, for instance, as well, we've received guidance that it might even be we might be liable if we weren't to include things like bollards or little armadillo humps, because vehicles may end up accidentally backing into those bays or causing accidents. So there's a number of really complicated technical constraints, particularly in the London context, that make it difficult to simply say just put a piece of paint on the ground and a bollard, and that will be your bay, especially when every single borough can kind of have their own authority over their own street network to design the guidance that they see fit. So it is really challenging. The enforcement strains are all challenging. It's all developing as well as more legal guidance comes out. There's a law review being undertaken right now, I think, at the DFT, involving a lot of highways regulations, and that could have further impacts. The additional legislative review on e-scooter use is going to have further impacts. So it continues to develop, and it's always in an ever-changing area where we're seeking to improve enforcement rates through a variety of means.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So I am going to ask a really broad streets policy question now, to bring some of the other issues in, and then we'll move back into some of the specific e-scooter questions. So one of the things that the Dott report highlights is how, particularly with COVID, street space has become more at a premium, more in demand, and we know that generally streets serve lots of different purposes. So they are places for movement, so that's walking, cycling, scooting, charging infrastructure, signs about parking restrictions. They are spaces for business. We're seeing a lot more outside hospitality. There is advertising. There are the private e-scooter and bike rental companies. We know there's lots of competition for curb space as we have more deliveries. And then they have a public space function. So they are places to exist in the public sphere. And so I know we've got lots of really interesting experience here in terms of local and national government. So what is a good way for local and national governments to go about trying to balance those different uses in trying to make sure the voices that all people are heard? And I appreciate that's a very big question that I'm sure lots of you could talk for an hour and a half on. Does anybody want to start with a few thoughts on that question?
That's such a huge open-ended question. I wouldn't be surprised everyone's going, what? So, right, streets and their purpose, movement and place. And if you look at somewhere like London, you have like a hierarchy of streets. You know, Giacomo, you could probably correct me on this, but essentially you've got one axis, which is movement, and the other axis is just place, and then every single road has been classified. There are 9 classifications. So that might be one way to start looking at the priority you give to modes of transport and or the place function per road in London. Most places won't use that kind of model. It's a really good conceptual way of actually thinking about what's most important, say, for example, on a local high street versus a residential street versus one of your red routes. But I think the same principle of actually thinking, what is it we're trying to achieve in this place, applies. So if you have a low traffic neighborhood, what you're trying to achieve are low speeds, less domination by vehicles, safer walking and cycling, children playing in the street without worrying about them being knocked over. If it's your high street, you're thinking about the time that people are spending there. So that someone called it a dwell time, but essentially, you know, it's the people walking there who are going to be going in and out of shops spending money, not the vehicles parked there. And if you're impeding that with a load of scooters and or people cycling on the pavement and dumping their scooters and or bikes in the way of people trying to walk down that high street, which may be busy, which may not be busy, but require extra space for safe walking at a social distance, then you're going to be impairing that, you know, the high streets function as a business location with people selling goods. So I think, you know, these are the sorts of things that need to go into the equation. How you do that, more difficult, but local cycling and walking infrastructure plans, for example, set out key walking routes, key cycle routes. The idea of them is to actually figure out what the infrastructure needs are for walking and cycling. So given that e-scooters are in principle allowed to share cycling infrastructure, you would want to be thinking perhaps of an extra layer on that kind of mapping exercise of where can we add in infrastructure for e-scooter parking in the carriageway, in the same way that you need to think about where people are going to put their bicycles at the end of the day. You know, if you're pedestrianising your high street, you're probably not wanting people to cycle in there, so you need to actually have some cycle parking in there. In terms of vehicle deliveries, we've had a proliferation of that, obviously with everyone shopping online, myself included. But, you know, you need to be thinking then about consolidating some of those deliveries, particularly for shops. You know, do you need delivery bays? What sorts of times are deliveries arriving? You know, in any pedestrianised area, you're going to have vehicle movements at some point in the day, just not all day. You might have a 2-hour window in the morning when vehicles can come in and people aren't shopping, for instance. So, I mean, all of these things go into it, and it's a bit of a nightmare for people like Giacomo and, you know, at Transport for London, in local authorities, etc. But it doesn't mean you can't do it. And in order to have places functioning most efficiently for different road users and different journey types, these are the sorts of considerations that we need to have.
Yeah, can I just concur with everything you said, Rachel? And I think, you know, when we were developing the City of London's transport strategy, all the things that you mentioned were relevant. And I think one of the ways that we tried to engage with, you know, workers, residents, visitors, and travelers in the city was to present them with an opportunity to discuss the vision. So using like vision-led strategic exercises and consultations that allow people to think about what they want their city to look like. Oftentimes, the work that you mentioned on movement in place that the Road Task Force did in London was really, really useful. But it can sometimes miss out on some of the sentiments that people have about particular spaces or the desires they have about travel. And it's a really useful framework. There's by no means, I'm not criticizing it. It's just challenging, I think, to fit all that together without including people that are going to be using streets. And so when we went to develop our transport strategy, we tried to reach out to as many people as we could. We ended up getting thousands of comments from 10,000 plus people, and we were able to then form a vision that tried to communicate the desires that people have for their streets. And ultimately, it kind of comes down to whether e-scooters and dockless bikes can fit in that vision, whether they enhance that vision, whether they deliver that vision. And the city, we think they could if they're well managed, but there's a lot of challenges to get there. But if people can still keep that discussion going and keep those communication channels open, then at least we can have, you know, these great discussions like we are today about what the future of these modes look like, and then can reflect on that and do our best to incorporate that into transport strategies and policies, which ultimately are what kind of govern the decisions that we make on infrastructure and change and investment in local authorities and more broadly. So yeah.
I just wanted to say the City of London transport strategy, one of the great things that you had was information about walking. And I can't stress that enough, because too often people don't record that information. Yeah. And you were able to show just, you know, that 90% figure of people walking either wholly or as part of their transport journey, you know, their commuter journey or whatever it was that day. But to be able to show that was ironclad, really.
Okay, so Ruth, if you want to go in generally, and then we'll link it back to e-scooters.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say what Rachel said, you know, excellent. And plus, I think a combination of the growing use of sat-navs has caused conflict in residential areas, growing a lot in the last 10 years. I was shocked. Overall traffic in London has increased 20% in the last 10 years, but 45% in minor residential roads. So the conflicts between different users is growing, and e-scooters are adding to that mix. And then, of course, COVID has changed people's travel choices considerably, adding to the pressures. So now is a challenge, but also an opportunity to relook at, in a sense, the hierarchy of travel patterns and travel modes, and So I really welcome the highway code consultation that seems to suggest that the government is looking at that concept of a hierarchy and prioritising you know, walking and forms of active travel, and that needs to be rolled out, as I say, in terms of regulation, how space is invested in and how it is used and enforced.
Super. So taking that very big question and bringing it down to an e-scooter or a dockless vehicle level, if a local authority decides that they feel that dockless vehicles are part of their vision and they feel that the parking model that they want to go for is a docked model, then can anybody tell us anything about the processes they've gone through to identify where suitable docks, bays, hubs, corrals might be? In my question box, Sarah Gayton, who I believe is from the National Federation of the Blind UK, saying very strongly she feels that they should never be on the pavement, they should always be in the carriageway. Juliana is asking questions about the legality of having docks, bays, hubs, corrals. I should just pick one word on the pavement. So what sort of processes should we be going through to make sure that if we think dockless vehicles are a good part of our transport system and our vision, that those parking spaces are correctly located? Who wants to go?
Well, first of all, I'm happy to take this. I think that, well, I hope what I've been able to show here is that we can do a better job of ensuring that vehicles are left in the correct places, and I believe that those correct places are also on the carriageway. I very much appreciate that Giacomo's perspective and the local authority perspective is that that's often a real challenge to find space on the carriageway, but it is essential, particularly with e-scooters, where we really don't want to be showing anyone, giving anyone an opportunity to use them on the footway. If you're able to park on the footway, then it's sending that message that it's okay to kind of go on the footway, even if, strictly speaking, it's for a very small amount of time to get into the parking bay. I think it's definitely sending the wrong message. So it's absolutely critical that we find carriageway parking where possible. In terms of locating, it's really important to the operators and local authorities are working together on ensuring that the locations make sense from a user perspective, but also from a non-user perspective. So focusing around transport interchanges, if there are areas which are no-go zones, be it completely pedestrianised areas or forecourts of railway stations, for example, then it's best to make sure that you collaborate as closely as possible to find locations around those attractors, because people will want to go there. We can't deny that. People will want to go there. That is a key use case. So let's give them options. So let's make sure that we give them something to aim at, as opposed to giving anyone the opportunity to kind of not abide by the rules. But yeah, my main point is that carriageway solution has to be what's focused on. I fully appreciate that it's probably the hardest one to do, but if we're going to get this right, as Ruth rightly mentions, we need to be looking at that very, very closely.
Yeah, our policy at the City of London is to locate all future dockless bays on the carriageway as well, if possible. To speak a bit with our experience with our dockless bike trial, we located all of those bays on pavement, which was controversial at the time. We thought the way that we located those bays is actually looking at existing Sheffield stand and Santander stand provision, and then identifying adjacent underused non-traveled space to provide for dockless bike share. So kind of our philosophy on it was trying to imagine what it would be like to extend Santander bays with a little bit of space that you could put dockless bikes into, and what that might look like. But it was challenging, and Sheffield stands are already located on pavements in many places, so there is cycling behavior. It does encourage a bit of cycling behavior on pavements. Widespread cycling on pavements isn't to be seen, but there's a challenge with the new mode, and that's why we kind of feel it's best to locate them on pavements. I agree with everything Duncan said about working with operators. We want the schemes to be successful ultimately. There's challenges around providing the right types of spaces. There's a lot of competition for space, particularly in high streets, and ultimately, many times we look for adjacent areas to provide those bays rather than provide them directly on high streets where that competition for space is high and where we believe the, people walking and people resting are meant to take priority. We take a lot of cues from Healthy Streets as well, the Healthy Streets guidance, and trying to understand how to best improve the quality of a street using the 10 metric or the variety metrics that are employed with that guidance. And sometimes, implementing a parking bay in that particular area doesn't really add to the quality and feel of a street. But ultimately, yeah, we tend to take quite a strategic view, look at underutilized spaces or car parking spaces, bring them forward, understand whether they're impacted by any particular technical issues like regular events that might require those bays being taken out, or drainage issues in a particular area, and then move forward to finalize the selection of those bays to use. And it's really challenging. I think each borough has a slightly different, each local authority has a slightly different way to approach it. But ultimately, it's done, the best way to do it is in consultation with the operators, because they do have a lot of knowledge on the types of locations that people want to park at. And I think that this is particularly important in some of the kind of interurban areas. In central London, you could probably put bays in most places and people would want to use them. There's so many trip attractors and reasons for people to travel to various locations. But in those interurban areas where you might not necessarily have the same level of travel and trip attraction, it's really important to use analytics and an understanding of the area. Sorry, Rachel, is there, you want to say something?
Sorry, I just want to put in a comment before we finish, that's all.
I'll pass it on to you then. I've said quite a bit already.
Sorry, I just wanted to say we haven't really covered enforcement of people scooting or cycling on the pavement. Now, the problem is we don't have, I mean, that would be the responsibility of the police, who have neither the capacity nor the priority, I'm afraid, for that. I'm wondering, and perhaps Ruth can also quickly comment on this, but with pavement parking proposing the decriminalising of obstruction and allowing civil enforcement officers to basically fine for vehicles causing an obstruction, I wonder, would that potentially offer an instrument for civil enforcement officers to basically hand out fines for inappropriate cycling and or scooting on the pavement? Just a thought. Because without that kind of enforcement, unfortunately, there's no other instrument beyond the police to police behaviour.
Oh, I could add something to that as well. I don't know, Rachel, were you directing that question at Ruth, or?
Simply directed it at Ruth as a member of the Transport Select Committee,
Yeah,
which has both commented on scooters and pavement parking at length.
Yeah, I mean, my take is that given what I've just said about the hierarchy of road users and travel methods, it seems logical in crowded urban areas that the carriageway is the better place for parking. I mean, certainly local authorities, I think our own local authority, certainly Ealing, has a number of residential cycle parking cages which are on the street. So one cage takes up one parking bay and can house about 8 cycles. So to me, that seems logical, that we should be taking the space out the carriageway rather than the footway.
I'm thinking of the actual moving though. So when someone is scooting, in the act of scooting, either on a private or a rental scooter on the pavement, you need a policeman or policewoman at the moment. I mean, the hierarchy of road users is already in the manual for streets, so it's advisory, and I mean, all the changes to the highway code are advisory and would be useful in a court of law, well, you know, if there's a claim brought against someone. But in terms of active enforcement, it would be great if we could get civil enforcement officers able to hand out fines in the way that they do in Paris, and I don't think we have the instruments available for that at the moment. And I was wondering if unnecessary obstruction, because essentially someone's sitting on the pavement is an obstruction.
Do we have any thoughts about civil enforcement of cycling or scooting on the pavement very quickly?
Can I just jump in and
30 seconds.
I'm not going to speak to it directly because you're right, Rachel. We don't necessarily have the powers. And if the powers were to come in, then maybe it's useful. But I also thought it's worthwhile highlighting that a lot of those people who are scooting on pavements are doing it because they don't feel safe on streets. So there could be an answer here, maybe a bit of a naive one, but to try and seek to improve the quality of streets where people travel by scooter quite a bit to make sure that they feel safe. And that would encourage them to use street space rather than use pavement space. It's something that we hear about cycling quite often. It's an argument that we use to invest in cycle lanes.
I'd have a final point, conscious of time, on that exact point, Giacomo, is that we've got routing software that pushes people into particular streets that are safer and quieter. So it's not going to hit everyone, but you know, the number of people that are using that to get from A to B, that will improve safety as well. But obviously, improving the general infrastructure is definitely preferable.
Brilliant. Thank you, Duncan. I'm going to cut you off there, I'm afraid. Ruth, you had a hand waving. Do you have a last 30 seconds?
Yeah, my apologies for answering the wrong question just now. You caught me multitasking, but I think there's obviously a national legislative piece of work to look at the powers of civil enforcement officers, because potentially that could be a self-funding service, because there's a whole range of public realm issues that could be brought into a single person in a single piece of street space. I do, you know, as soon as we can get really fine-grained geo fencing on, you know, would it be possible, say, for a aggrieved pedestrian to take a photo of somebody scooting along a footway, a rental scooter on a footway, and you know, link and put that up to the provider, and that might turn into a fine for that user, for instance. But you know, we've got to make people feel safe walking on footways, because at the moment in too many crowded city centres and suburban centres, they don't.
I think that is a fantastic point to end on. Thank you everybody for all of your engagement. Apologies to the people with unanswered questions. We had really interesting questions about how all this might interact with privately owned scooters, even when we have them, about the interactions between scooters, other forms of active travel and infrastructure. Lots of questions. Matthew, I'm sorry, your fantastic question about our vision for 2023 will have to roll over to another webinar. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for their time, for their expertise. It has been a really interesting session for me. I hope it's been an interesting session for everybody. Thanks again to Dott for making this seminar happen. And that is all from us today. Have a lovely day.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Lorna. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Lorna. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.